Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 14th February 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Where do we start? Minister for War would be a good place, I think. Here he is, Gavin Williamson. The Russians have said that really he's a Monty Python minister. And I have to say I agree with them. What's this man been saying? Well, let's put in the first bit. He says that this threat, the Russian threat, is real. It's on our doorstep, Mike. I don't know, does that mean they're at Calais now? Have they moved across Europe and the Russians are at Calais? Or are they coming in the back door via Ireland or Scotland?
Yes.
We don't know. But He says we should not underestimate the damage Russia could do. I've added a little bit in there. That's why I've sent 16 tanks and 600 men to show those nasty Russians what we can do. I won't be on the battlefield personally, though.
No.
So where have we got this from? Well, we've got it from the Daily Star. This is an article which people must read. UK tanks and troops ready for war on Russia's doorstep in message to Putin. So there we are. I've estimated 16 tanks. There might be 50 armoured personnel carriers. This is peanuts, Mike, absolute peanuts. But of course, it's not on our doorstep. It's all going on to the Russians' doorstep. So this is clearly an aggressive playtime thing going on here. So this is some of the embedded video that the Star's got, and you can have a look at this impressive or not so impressive array of vehicles. But we're apparently going to war because the Russians are on our doorstep. That's why we're sending troops to the Russians' doorstep.
The rhetoric is spectacular. So this is tantamount to what we covered yesterday with this nonsense about sending one Type 23 destroyer to the South China Sea.
Yeah.
The Russians and the Chinese have got to be laughing at us, but our media is full of this fake news.
Well, I think what's happening is that because the plot is so ridiculous and the media's got to follow the script, follow the plot, they're now just being exposed as complete idiots. The Russians are laughing openly at Britain's defence minister, quite rightly, because he's clearly just out of school, doesn't understand what he's got into. He's destroying the armed forces. We're blaming the Russians for being aggressive on our doorstep, clearly untrue. Where are we sending 16 tanks and possibly 600 men? We're sending them to Estonia. That's where those exercises are taking place.
Yeah.
Just mind-boggling stuff.
Well, the baby-faced assassin is in Brussels today. This is today and tomorrow, the defence ministers' meeting for NATO. And that's going to begin today with the meeting of the nuclear planning group. And this is part of their what they describe as regular consultations to keep NATO nuclear forces safe, secure and effective. They're also going to take decisions apparently on modernising NATO's command structure. Now this looks very like modernising NATO's command structure with a view to EU military unification, because one thing that they expect, command that they expect to create is an Atlantic command, and then they're going to create a European command, which is a support command, they say at this point. And as well as that, they're going to open a new cyber, or at least agree a new cyber operations centre. And then later in the day, they say that they're going to address defence spending and burden sharing amongst allies. Now, NATO claims, as you can see in the tweet there on screen, NATO claims that the UK has met its 2% spending obligations, which is all very good. But is it true? Because this is the Institute for Strategic Studies, and their global defence spending, well, their headline here on their page is Global Defence Spending Stagnation Persists in 2017. This is coming out of their latest Military Balance report, Military Balance 2018. It costs about £500 to buy that report, but they've kindly put some information online from it. And they're saying that the UK didn't meet its 2% of GDP spending on defence pledge for a second year in a row. They say that we spent slightly less than that at 1.98%. And as I say, that's the same figure that the ISS reported for the previous year. The Ministry of Defence contests that statement. Jens Stoltenberg says different as well. Jens Stoltenberg, when he was giving his doorstep meeting or his doorstep briefing to the press this morning, said he was encouraged at the number of alliance countries that were edging closer to the symbolic 2% GDP target, and he acknowledged that only 15 states, half of the 29 alliance members, would reach the milestone by 2024. He said this is substantial progress and a good start, but we have a good way to go. And according to NATO, the UK spent 2.14% of GDP on defence. The Ministry of Defence said that the International Institute for Strategic Studies figures were wrong. NATO's own figures clearly show that the UK is one of the few countries to spend over 2% of GDP on defence. And they said in the face of intensifying threats, undoubtedly from Russia, we not only meet but exceed the target, and it remains the base rather than a ceiling. So there you go. But I mean, the main issue for the defence ministers' meeting is this issue of spending, and they're particularly concerned, and the US at least is expressing concern about the continuing moves to create an EU military bloc, and they're concerned that with an EU military bloc, or at least they're concerned that spending is maintained at the end of the EU military bloc or enhanced. They want to see the EU stepping up to the plate with 2% of GDP right across the board. Many EU countries not doing that, and that, of course,
Well, I just wanted to say that is northward, the picture.
That is northward,
so
yes.
that people understand that Brexit is not real. That is a picture of the European Union fully integrated into British defence. This is northward headquarters. There we are, multinational headquarters. There's the EU flag. So everything the Conservative Party says at the moment about Brexit is a complete lie, because the objective is full military unification with the EU. And I'll just add to that, Mike, it's just fascinating how the first thing that was ramped up was those nasty pirates. We had so many Somali pirates, so many pirates out in the Red Sea area, that we had to bring in Western military naval forces to deal with those. That set up the EU's Operation Atlanta. And then what have they done? They've drifted that Atlanta organisation back into the NATO, the British and NATO military structure, so that here we are with Theresa May saying we're coming out of the EU, but in fact there's a joint headquarters at Northwood.
Absolutely. Now, spending is a key part of this, as I say. This is the main concern of the Americans. It was certainly the main concern of Donald Trump when he visited the new NATO headquarters last May. That's the 9/11 memorial that he's standing beside there. And when he gave his speech, he was concerned, particularly at many European countries that are not spending 2% of GDP on defence. So, as I say, the United States' concern at this NATO defence ministers meeting is to make sure, not a concern that the EU is creating this defence bloc as a thing. They are concerned that once that bloc is created, that the spending is increased. And back in the UK then, of course, we continue to see how we're not spending any money on defence in this country. So perhaps this makes a lie of what the Ministry of Defence is saying about spending more than 2% of GDP, because this is the latest report from the Defence Committee. And they're saying that the United Kingdom will lose its ability to conduct specialised amphibious operations if leaked plans considered to the National Security Capability Review are not cancelled by a modernising defence programme, according to the Commons. That's their statement from their website, and they quote their chairman, Dr. Julian Lewis, who said, in January, we were told that the Albion and Bulwark were not due to leave service until 2033 and 2034, respectively. That such irreplaceable ships are in line for deletion 15 years early demonstrates yet again the desperate inadequacy of the defence budget. We must reinstate a target of around 3% of GDP, the percentage which we spent right up to the mid-1990s, long after the peace dividend cuts at the end of the Cold War had been made. Gavin Williamson deserves credit for seizing back control of the defence dimension of the NSCR process, but ultimately he will fail without extra funding from the Treasury. Unless he secures this, the Royal Marines will be reduced to a level far below the critical mass needed to sustain them as a high readiness commando force. And of course, the point you've been making, Brian, is that with defence cuts after defence cuts after defence cuts, it's not just the Royal Marines which are not really sustainable as a unit, but this goes right across the military structure of the UK. And why are they doing that? In order to fit us in with the EU defence union strategy. So the Treasury isn't going to provide more money until that EU defence mechanism is finally a done deal as far as the British public are concerned.
Yeah, so British military is going to be, the cuts are going to continue to bring this parity with the French. Now, I was told that a few days ago, Macron, or at least the French government, was announcing a massive increase in defence spending for the French. I think the figure of 30% was mentioned. Also, I saw an article saying that Macron was going to restart conscription. Now, I don't know whether that was being discussed or whether it was actually going to start, but massive expansion of the French forces, massive suppression of British armed forces, and this is to achieve the so-called parity, which allows that full EU military unification. So everything, we'll stress this point, everything that Theresa May says about Brexit, everything the Conservative government says in Britain about Brexit is a complete lie, because Britain's armed forces are continually being fully integrated into this pan-European system. Once it's finally occurred, of course, we don't have a nation state, because Britain will not be in control of its own armed forces.
And just finally on this then, also at the Defence Ministers meeting for NATO in Brussels, we had Gavin Williamson meeting his counterparts from Australia, Canada, New Zealand and the United States. This is a so-called Five Eyes alliance. We don't know yet what was discussed at that. We just know that that meeting took place, and we will see if we can find out for tomorrow's programme a little bit more on that.
Fascinating stuff. Well, we're going to say thank you to the people who send us snippets. We receive a lot of information which comes in. People pick up things that we would not just see on our own. This was a very interesting tweet. We were fascinated by it. It had come through Spec Inf Group. But what we were looking at was Modern War Institute, the urban warfare project. The world is becoming more urban. We need to prepare for cities to becoming battlefields. Now, I found this incredible language because, of course, at the moment we're being told that the Russians are the main threat. Does this mean we're going for another Operation Barbarossa? We're going into Stalingrad? Is that what they're talking about? Or are they talking about violence flaring up inside urban centres? Where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from the Modern War Institute. This is actually part of the American West Point military organisation. And if you just have a look at part of the text here, it says Modern War Institute at West Point is a national resource within the Department of Military Instruction that studies recent and ongoing conflicts to prepare present and future leaders to win in a complex world. And so it goes on, and they're boasting that they are preparing military cadets through scholarships, multidisciplinary, contemporary battlefield assessments, symposia, curriculum update and relevancy, academic outreach and strategic communications. This has a lot of newspeak about it, Mike. And of course, who will be advising these sorts of training groups? Well, it will come back to the globalist agenda that we see going on wherever it is, G8 or Davos, coming straight back into the military. So here we are, Urban Warfare Project. And there's a quote here by General Mark A. Milley, Chief of Staff of the US Army. In the future, I can say with very high degrees of confidence, the American Army is probably going to be fighting in urban areas. We need to man, organise, train and equip the force for operations in urban areas, highly dense urban areas, and that's a different construct. We're not organised like that right now. So this is suggesting that the American Army is going to do, or the American military is going to do a massive change of objective to focus on fighting in urban areas. Where will those urban areas be? Will they be in Eastern Europe, cities in Eastern Europe and Russia, because that's where we're told the threat comes from? Or could it be, as some people suggest, that the American people are going to take things into their own hands in the United States itself?
Okay, well, let's move on to Brexit. The road to Brexit. Boris Johnson giving a speech today in the newspapers is being described as a Valentine's Day speech, so it must be very loving, I'm sure. And this is apparently the first in a series of speeches which various cabinet ministers are going to give over the next few days, leading up to Theresa May giving a speech in Germany at the weekend. And he is very concerned, Brian, that people are becoming even more determined in their efforts to stop Brexit. He says, I believe that would be a disastrous mistake that could lead to permanent and ineradicable feelings of betrayal. We cannot and we will not let it happen. So there you go. But if we are to carry this project through to national success, as we must, then we must reach out to those who still have anxieties. I want to try today to autonomize at least some of those fears and to show the best of my ability that they are unfounded and that the very opposite is usually true, that Brexit is not grounds for fear, but hope. So there you go. That's what he has to say. I'm feeling much better already that he's absolutely on the case and is going to bring us successfully out of the European Union. You must agree with me on that.
Well, I think what he said is that he's going to give you hope. So there's going to be a hope of coming out the European Union, but that isn't actually going to happen, is it, Mr. Johnson, because you are stitching the British military into the EU military system?
Among other things. Okay, finance then. Well, we have to go back to Russia a little bit here because, of course, Russia has been threatened for a number of years now about being removed from the SWIFT interbank cash transfer services. And this is Arkady Dvorkish. Sorry,
yes,
I pronounced that incorrectly. I do apologize.
Dvorkovich.
He is the Deputy Prime Minister in Russia. Well, he's now saying that the Russian banks are ready for this at last. So it doesn't really matter what the United States or Europe does. He said, certainly it is unpleasant as it will prove a stumbling block for companies and banks in Russia and will slow down work. It will be inevitable to deploy some aged technologies for information transfer and calculations. However, the companies are technically and psychologically ready for the shutdown as this threat was repeatedly voiced. And he said that any measure that would have a negative effect on corporations working in the US and Europe is particularly of concern. He said, in general, disconnecting Russia from SWIFT would be a crazy step on the part of our Western partners. It is obvious that for the companies which work in Europe and the US, it would be harmful, and this applies not only to the shutdown of the service. So Russia is saying that they're ready for that. In the meantime, people that aren't ready, perhaps for certain things, is the Western banking system, and this is the well, he's clearly had plenty to eat, anyway, not short of a few bob. Is this gentleman? Is the new head of the Bank for International Settlements, and he's saying that there's a very strong case for the BIS and central bankers to sort of get hold of digital currencies and regulate them to death. Really, this was apparently his first major public speech as the head of the Bank for International Settlements. This is Bank for International Settlements General Manager Augustin Carstens. And he said Bitcoin is not functional as a means of payment, but it relies on the oxygen provided by the connection to standard means of payments and trading apps that link users to conventional bank accounts. If the only business case is used for illicit or illegal transactions, central banks cannot allow such tokens to rely on much of the same institutional infrastructure that serves the overall financial system and freeload on the trust that it provides. Well, hold on a second, Mr. Carstens. It's your financial system which has been laundering drug money for 150 years, quite successfully. There's a certain level of hypocrisy which is a bit beyond my ability to describe in this statement?
Well, what they're worried is that somebody else is moving onto their patch, Mike. That's the big problem. And of course, Bank of International Settlements, BIS, is the bank in control of the other major banks. So we've got a huge power base here. And of course, BIS, when members of the British Constitution Group at least have talked to members of Parliament and said to them, what about the Bank of International Settlements? These MPs don't even know what it is. So a man of immense power, clearly he's been on the Eric Pickles slimming course, but I think they're very worried that somebody else had challenged the banking system in this way.
Absolutely. And on Monday we mentioned this report from the Resolution Foundation on debt and the implications for the amount of debt that individuals and households are carrying in the UK if interest rates rise, as Mark Carney is suggesting. Well, this is a new report out now via the Labour Party, who were pushing freedom of information requests into the Office for Budget Responsibility, which pretty much echoes the Resolution Foundation's report. And they found that they expect the cost of servicing debt amongst UK households to climb by almost 30% by 2023. So that's, what's that, 5 years? So that's of concern, and it's not going to take huge levels of interest rate increases to cause that to happen.
No. Is that a Bank of International Settlements burger there on that one?
It could well be.
Could well be. There we go. Well, let's put up a picture of a banker. Well, of course he's not. My goodness, it's complicated, and The Independent has taken up the cause of George Soros, the billionaire investor who became the favourite target of conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic hatred. Some attacks contain overtones of anti-Semitism, while others target the billionaire who broke the Bank of England for being a globalist financier. So apparently if you call him a globalist financier, this is some form of hate speech.
Yes.
So he's worth about 18 billion as a minimum. He broke the Bank of England. That sounds pretty dangerous to me. But if you call him a globalist financier, then this is hate speech. And in fact, it makes you anti-Semitic. It's really fascinating. Well, let's have a look at the article. It's written by David Finkelstein. This is the Times one I've got in front of me. Let's get this right. And so he starts off by saying, as I write this, in front of me sits the German Reich and Prussian State Gazette of August the 28th, 1939. It contains a list running to 2 pages of citizens living abroad who are being stripped. George Soros and the roots of anti-Semitism. So another one here. So he starts off with very emotive language. He goes on to the protocols, the Jew as a secret plotter, puppet master, subverter of nations, rootless cosmopolitan. He goes on to attack the right-wing populist governments in Hungary and Poland because they've selected George Soros as their public enemy. But on the left, of course, the same conspiracy thrives, just in a different guise. The international Jewish superstate is Israel, and the elders of Zion are the plotters. So remember, this is just because people pointed out that George Soros was giving a large amount of money to an organisation trying to turn the tables on 17 million people in Britain who voted to leave the EU. If you dare to criticise this man, then the Times and the Independent are going to say that you're anti-Semitic. But towards the end of this immensely poor article, the journalist says this: the idea on the populist left and right that there is an international elite resting on global capital, hanging out in Davos, working often in secret to frustrate the interests of the people, is a profoundly unhealthy one.
Really?
And false. It allows, Davos isn't the hub of a new world order. It's a boring conference in a freezing location where people sit on panels and talk about corporate policy on climate change. And George Soros isn't a puppet master, and his plot isn't secret. He's just a rich guy paying for some leaflets about Brexit.
Wow.
I mean, Mike, I have to say that you cannot read this article without laughing because it's so pathetic. We have Daniel Finkelstein getting his knickers in a very big twist because people have dared to point out that George Soros is paying vast amounts of money to overturn a democratic vote in UK. Nobody has said anything about him being Jewish. Nobody has accused him of being in some sort of Jewish state conspiracy. People have just pointed out what he's been doing. But here we've got a journalist. Is he thinking correctly anymore?
No, I don't think any of them are.
I don't think they are. No. Well, we're going to smile at that. So just remember, don't dare accuse George Soros of being a banker or anything like that, because the Times will be on your case. Well, of course, what does Davos and the G8 and the global leaders get up to? Well, actually, it's doing things like this. So here we've got a Guardian article, London community school teacher in the last 10 for a $1 million global prize. So here she is, Andrea Safirakou, and she's been shortlisted from more than 30,000 people for a teaching award. So the article, when you get into it, looks fairly innocuous, but what you need to look for is this, where this award came from. And here we've got the Farkey Foundation. Sonny Farkey is founder and executive chairman of GEMS Education Group. He's a passionate education entrepreneur. He's also tightly connected to the World Economic Forum. So that would bring us roughly back into George Soros's field. Microsoft, UNESCO, and the Clinton Global Initiative.
Yeah.
So we've got a school teacher in Britain who's very happy because the Clintons and others have said, we like you. And we'll come on to why they like her in a minute. But dig in and have a look. We had a look at some of the people. We found some Michael Lockett. Has a portfolio of businesses that operate across the communications spectrum, centered around corporate, political and institutional leadership, ideal for teaching awards. But he was also big in the 1992 general election campaign, leadership of the Conservative Party's presentation unit for the Prime Minister John Major, and he even helped out David Cameron. So you think it's a little award by independent organisation. No, this is the British government with its finger in the pie, so to speak. So here's GEMS. You can have a look at that. I loved this image, Mike, of the little blue-eyed, blonde-haired girl, but only one eye showing. I'm sure a few people might pick up on that. And if we just add in a bit more here, what are they doing? From an international curriculum to contact with our overseas schools all over the world, GEMS offers a truly global education, helping young people become well-informed world citizens. So they liked the teacher because she said that basically she's got to welcome parents in 35 different languages to make them feel comfortable bringing their children into her school. So this is not about rewarding a teacher. This is about promoting global citizenship. And of course, this man is at the back of it, Bill Gates. This is what he says: when you think about what drives progress and improvement in the world, education is like a master switch, one that opens up all sorts of opportunities for individuals and societies. Of course, what he really meant was this: one that opens up all sorts of opportunities for individuals like me and our societies. So we're not to know who these illustrious, immensely wealthy leaders are pushing this policy through, but they're going to do it by giving our school teachers awards to make them feel good. And sorry, that was, if you want to see it, that was the headline of that Times article that I read out. There we are, getting his knickers in a twist about Mr. Soros. We're going to label that fake and misleading news. I couldn't think of anything better than that, Mike.
Right. Today we have the Agenda 2030 for Children End Violence Solutions Summit in Stockholm. Penny Mordaunt is there, of course. Well, what's this all about? This is a global partnership to end violence against children. It's where all major stakeholder groups come together to focus their words, actions and resources on ending violence against children, a unique public-private partnership for all actors to hold themselves to account and work together to prevent and respond to violence against children. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. It includes governments, UN agencies, international organizations, civil society, faith groups, the private sector, philanthropic organizations, foundations like Soros, for example, research practitioners, academics, and children themselves. So they're going to meet in Stockholm, or they're meeting in Stockholm today. They're saying we're issuing an urgent call to action, bringing together governments, the UN, civil society, and so on, and responding to violence against boys and girls during the first End Violence Solutions Summit. It will be a crucial meeting in our common responsibility to combat violence against children. And they say that in 2015, world leaders acknowledged the severity of epidemic levels of violence against children and committed to end all forms of violence and exploitation of children by 2030 as part of the Sustainable Development Goals in Agenda 2030. And this summit is a major milestone towards achieving that commitment. Well, as I say, Penny Mordaunt is there today giving a speech. She's pledging £5 million of government funding, Department for International Development funding, to help protect vulnerable children across the globe following allegations of sexual abuse by Oxfam in Haiti. Now, of course, £5 million, that is a huge proportion of the billions of pounds that are made in profits by people who do exploit children every year. So, of course, that's going to have a major impact, Brian. No, right, didn't think so. The International Development Secretary is going to announce that following that funding at this meeting. She was also commenting on Oxfam and other charities, and she says, unless you, the charities, create a culture that prioritises safety of vulnerable people and ensures victims and whistleblowers can come forward without fear, we will not work with you. So, hold on, this is Penny Mordaunt, who works for Theresa May, who's the person who has made sure that people are imprisoned for whistleblowing or are being hounded out of their jobs for whistleblowing and so on. Anything to do with child sexual abuse, you're going to end up in either in prison and in solitary confinement, or you're going to lose your job and be...
Well, this is absolutely correct, Mike, and I can say that we now know accurately and for certain that Theresa May had a personal briefing about the despicable treatment of Met Police whistleblower John Wedger. That was about a 15-minute conversation with British Prime Minister Theresa May to say that a policeman who'd blown the whistle on the grooming, abuse and deaths of children in London and the cover-up by politicians, local authorities and charities, Theresa May personally briefed on it, did nothing.
Well, Penny Mordaunt then saying that she's going to deal with Oxfam by referring them to the National Crime Agency. She said that while investigations have to be completed and any potential criminal prosecuted accordingly, what is clear is that the culture that is allowed to happen needs to change, and it needs to change now. We will just remind Penny Mordaunt and others, of course, that, well, what did the chief executive of Oxfam say? Basically, well, if you think we're bad, lots of the other international organisations are much worse. Yeah. So you know, this has got to be dealt with, and we'll keep an eye on that conference and report on it in due course.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that, Mike. Well, let's bring in Melanie Shaw, and I'm pleased to say that I had a letter from her yesterday. She says she's got mixed news. She is getting time out of her cell now. She is able to go to church, which is very good. She had her meagre pay that she can earn for doing certain jobs withheld for 6 weeks. She didn't have the facilities to hand wash her own tracksuit, so now she's got some clothes. She's apparently living in dirty clothes. She says the Samaritans are very supportive, but she's still actually having a very hard time. She says that MP for Nottingham South is Ken Clarke, the ex-Chancellor. I stayed quiet on that for over 2 years. maybe a nudge in his direction will help, as he's very influential and powerful. So I'm not quite sure what Melanie is getting at there. Yes, of course, Ken Clarke is one of the Nottingham MPs. Do you think he's likely to help, Mike? I thought this was the man who was keen for courts to become even more secret.
I think he's very unlikely to help, Brian. But I'm willing to keep an open mind. If Ken Clarke wants to pick up the phone and ask how he might help, then I'm sure you would be willing to speak to him.
Or indeed, if some of our viewers and listeners might like to contact Mr. Clarke very politely and ask him what he's doing to help Melanie Shaw, will be intrigued with the answers. Let's just bring in Amber Rudd, because of course all this takes joint effort by Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and the Home Secretary. And I tweeted this out yesterday. I couldn't resist it because, of course, she'd been boasting that she could use AI to nail 94% of Islamic State online terrorism with 99.995% accuracy. But, of course, with child abuse, our estimate is that she can only do about 3.9995%. And that's largely because we don't want to upset the Westminster apple cart. But then she is one of the boys. So there we have it. A funny old world, unless you're a child abuse survivor. So this caught my interest, that we've suddenly gone very big on the journalist Zaghari Ratcliffe. Now, this lady has been in Iranian jail for some months now, some considerable time. I don't have any doubt accepting that she's probably living in appalling conditions. But we've got a remarkable contrast here. We've got a BBC journalist who effectively gets the full support of the British government, Westminster, Boris Johnson. We have a child abuse survivor whose only crime is to blow the whistle on horrific abuse of children and indicate, of course, that politicians were involved, and she gets no help at all. If we look at how severe Melanie's treatment has been, that was her leg ulcer, which was untreated for the entire time she was in Sodexo prison in Peterborough. So this is a British woman, child abuse survivor. This is how the British government treats her in prison. And of course, Melanie has spent well over 18 months in solitary confinement, 23.5 hours a day. But when we come to the BBC journalist, her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, has been meeting Boris Johnson. There we are with the top picture. So he's brought into the heart of government to plead for his wife's case. We've now got a charity involved. Let me just bring that up on screen for the hard of seeing, which is myself, Redress. We spoke to that organisation this morning. They're interested to talk to us about Melanie this afternoon, so we'll see what happens. But apparently Redress is now putting Ms. Ratcliffe's case through to the United Nations. So what a difference. If you work for the BBC, the British government is in to help you. But if you're Melanie Shaw, the British government does not want to even know you. And of course, the man in the middle here, Boris Johnson, he had to apologise for this. He said, of course, I apologise for the distress, for the suffering that's been caused by the impression I gave that I believe that she was there in a professional capacity. Miss Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, she was there on holiday. So Boris thought that she was there training journalists, but he then had to apologise in Parliament because he got that idea out of nowhere, Mike, just out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So what a horrific difference between what the British government would expect of Iran and what the British government is prepared to do to a child abuse survivor in a prison in Britain.
Okay, health then. Sputnik reporting this morning, the Dutch Senate passes law making people's organs government property. This is about the Netherlands passing legislation which means that you've got to choose to opt out of, so they've changed the rules of consent in the Netherlands about whether you will donate your organs if you pass away for some reason or if you're in an accident, for example. Under the new legislation, Sputnik says every person over 18 will be included in the organ donor register unless they specifically say they don't want to be. Every Dutch adult who's not yet registered as a donor will receive a letter asking whether or not they want to become donors after death. If they don't respond to the first letter, a second one will be sent, and if it goes unanswered, they'll be automatically added to the donor list. Now, that's happening in the UK as well in the not too distant future. Wales and Scotland are already in that situation. I'm not certain that any letters are being sent. There's just the automatic presumption that you're giving your consent. So I just wanted to highlight this article on the UK Column website, No Time to Die. It's been up for a couple of weeks now. The article is pointing out that the government considers that it is the right time to revisit the issue of consent and to change the legal default on consent for organ and tissue donation in England. Although 8 out of 10 people say they would want to donate their organs and tissue after their death, most never register to be organ donors. This change would mean the system better reflects the position of the majority of people who would be happy to donate their organs and tissue when they die. It will also respect the decision of those who do not wish to be organ and tissue donors. In both the UK and in Holland, and also in I think France and Spain have already done this as well. There's apparently a huge need for organ donations because there's a huge backlog of people waiting for organs. And the point that's being made in this article on the Column website isn't that you shouldn't be donating your organs. It's really saying you should be doing so with full understanding of what it is that you're getting involved in. And one of the points that's being made is that even though traditional wisdom would state that the brain has stopped functioning and therefore consciousness and awareness could not continue, that scientific investigation had demonstrated that the brain had stopped functioning, but the patient was still conscious and aware. And then it goes on to say, well, at least an anesthetic is administered to the organ donor prior to removal of their organs, isn't it? Which, of course, it is, but there's no analgesic component to that. So the anesthetic, which is given, is there to paralyze. It's not there to give any pain relief. And in fact, the point that the article is making is that there is significant scientific evidence in the scientific literature that people are not being treated correctly during the time that their organs are being harvested. So have a read at that, share it if you wish. It's not it's pretty grim reading in some areas, but I think it's better to understand exactly what you're getting into before you consent.
Indeed. And well, I was almost going to apologise, but I'm not going to apologise. We're ending on a pretty dark note from the BBC. BBC's got to be watched very carefully because aside from fake news and the fact that 83% of Britons, as shown in that Daily Mail survey, do not trust the BBC, they are really now getting into some very dark and unpleasant manipulation of people's minds. So as I looked at the BBC main header page this morning, this popped up, Making Murderers. I was fascinated by that image because I thought, is this making murderers out of black men? What is this to do with? Where does it lead through? Well, it leads through to this Valentine's Day. This is part of, I'm going to call it a docudrama. I couldn't find any parental warning on this, but it's immensely dark, depressing stuff with graphic details of murder. Children, of course, have free access to this stuff, but the BBC doesn't make any, doesn't give any warnings to parents. So this is the key bit of it, Making Murderers, and it goes in great detail to this extremely unpleasant murder on this location, and it's told in this highly interactive graphic form. So you've got these immensely dark, powerful images come up. You're not sure after a while where you're reading factual content or you are in some sort of horror movie. But I found this one really shocking, and I'm going to say we'd be very grateful if there's some parents out there who share our concern, if you would join us in challenging the BBC as to why there's no parental guidance on this stuff. So here we are, BBC News 7, James Street, and then of course with no time at all, somebody sent through something else, Shetland Review, the body count mounts in this stunningly bleak drama. All of this is very dangerous stuff, particularly for people who perhaps suffer a bit of depression or they've anxiety, whatever it is. This is deliberately calculated material to make people sick, in my opinion. And what have we got here? Well, this is a graphic, real report of an incident where a man had murdered a woman. He then jumped out of a window, landed on a car below, attempted to assault the woman passenger in the car, went on to assault another woman. What took place in this murder, we don't know, but this man was in a very psychotic state. And I'm going to say chicken egg, which comes first? Are the murders coming, or are these things the result of at least of some of the material that's being put through on the BBC and graphic stuff in this particular one? So I'm sorry to end on such a dark note, but if we are to stop what's happening to this country at the moment, we've really got to understand what the BBC in particular is up to as a very dangerous psychological propaganda machine. Okay, well, there we are. Latest news from Melanie. I'll try and formulate that into more of a concise report tomorrow. But the good news is that at least she's getting some time out of her cell. Please, if you've got time, write to Theresa May, write to Ken Clarke, write to everybody you can possibly manage, pointing out this horrific hypocrisy over women in prison in Iran versus women in prison in UK. As somebody said on the chat box, that solitary confinement for extended periods of time is torture. That is what the United Nations has classified it as. Melanie Shaw has done over 18 months of torture in a British prison. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.